Hi, everyone. I want to start out by saying I'm excited to be at a conference in person for the first time in 2.5 years. We were just talking about whether I am used to giving talks, and I said I'm not sure. I haven't done it in a long time. But I'm really excited to be here, sharing a few of my ideas with you all and getting your thoughts. If you don't know me, I'm Liam. I'm a designer and as a design advocate at Google working on material design. What that means is that I contribute to the material design system, and I also work with designers outside Google to improve design across all our ecosystems. It is important to note, because we're going to get kind of abstract and theoretical today, that I'm here just as myself, talking about my own ideas for the future of design, not necessarily about Google's plans or products. This talk is kind of a synthesis of a lot of things that I've been thinking about over the past several years, and things that I've been working on. This isn't the full essay with all the details, but just an introduction to get us thinking about possible futures for the discipline of creating digital interface. I hope you'll follow me to check out the rest when I post it online, and I'll give a link later. With that out of the way, how many times have you seen an image that describes the experience of a UX designer? What comes to mind? Maybe the image that has been the most pervasive, vacillating between ironic and earnest at various moments, is that of 2 bottles of ketchup. On the left, there's the glass bottle that stands upright with a metal screw-top lid. It's the kind of bottle that you have to hit with an open palm or stick a knife into to get things going. But the image implies it's at least aesthetically nice. It stands for the type of design that looks nice regardless of its impact on experience. There are a lot of implicit value statements in this image that this bottle, helpfully labeled UI, is most concerned with visuals and sacrifices all else. On the right, the plastic bottle with the lid facing down. This one squirts, and gravity helps ketchup stay near the opening. The lid is even bigger for better balance. It is ostensibly, given its label as UX, a bottle whose primary concern is ease of use, a good experience, and more ketchup. The image, of course, can illustrate for us that this bottle you still need to shake, will probably fall over, gets crusty around the opening, and is made of single-use plastic that is, in all likelihood, going to be dumped in the ocean. There's also the desire path, showing a well-trod dirt path cutting through the grass next to a perfectly maintained sidewalk. The sidewalk is instructively labeled as design, again aesthetic, full of visual function and meaning, clearly representing a design intent, and the desire path is labeled user experience. This image, too, is loaded with implicit beliefs. The desire path would tell us that perhaps the designer should have made a diagonal sidewalk instead of a perpendicular one, or perhaps that user experience really means that the user will do whatever they want to accomplish a task, no matter how carefully we place our bricks. Finally, and I'm sure this isn't the last one that comes to mind, there's the gif of the guy with a glass of water who can't seem to take a drink. A straightforward task like drinking water is made to look impossible, even though to us as viewers, the answer is right there. If we're viewing it as designers, we see that someone has designed a glass for holding water and putting to your mouth, and we give a knowing chuckle to the representation of a user who just can't figure it out. These images feel relatable to us at different stages of the design process, and they may provide some much-needed comic relief, but they share another common factor with one another. They frame the intent and the context of the user as an aberration, something to be worked around, to predict and influence, to standardize, or in the worst case, to ignore. If these images are any kind of touchstone for our understanding of our discipline, we can probably also use them for some critical reflection, right? Our work creating interfaces doesn't typically deal with ketchup bottles, sidewalks, or glasses of water. The technology we use to implement an interface is digital. The metaphorical bottle we're producing doesn't even have to have a fixed shape. It's customizable. Its shape, color, size, elevation, placement are all easily changeable. Likewise, our sidewalks can be reconfigured for specific use cases or tasks. A trail through nearby grass shouldn't be a problem or an interesting side effect. It should be something that we welcome and facilitate. Why can't someone drink out of the bottom of a glass of water when the glass itself is virtual? If we imagine this happening in actual space, it sounds a little outlandish. We understand these objects to be the fixed result of a process of production. Even the word product, which we certainly use to describe our own work as designers and developers, implies something that's produced, something that's lying at the end of a process rather than in the middle or the beginning or somewhere totally outside the process of creation. And as such, most products are resistant to change. They're inflexible, their properties are unbending. Put simply, they can't adapt. Many, if not most, of the products that we encounter in the actual space of the world today are understood to be the result of so-called mass production. a process that owes its speed and efficiency to the standardization of the objects it produces. To make a new type of ketchup bottle, you need new molds for glass or plastic, new designs, machined parts that can precisely reproduce the bottle over and over again. Over time, incremental improvements can be made in response to material costs, manufacturing processes, and customer response. That is to say, the products are the outcome of a conversation between creator and the person experiencing the creation. With the advent of digital or virtual products, the things that we're making, that is, products that are reproduced with low-level materials like electricity rather than higher-level physical materials like glass or concrete, the pace of this conversation is quickened significantly, and it has the ability to become more dimensional and inclusive than ever before. As designers and developers making products for a digital platform, we have an unprecedented ability to iterate on ideas and change products over and over again, fine-tuning them to match our goals and the goals of our users. Despite this, we are all too often essentially manufacturing the bottles really, really, really fast, rather than changing something in the fundamental discipline of, I guess, in this metaphor, something like containing and dispensing ketchup. Something that would provide the basic capability for the ketchup, but leave the details like grip, volume, weight, shape, and color up to each person's realities. Keller Easterling, in a discussion of her book Extra Statecraft, put it best in a quote that I keep coming back to. "You don't square up to every weed in this field with a righteous fight. You change something in the soil." Right now, our collective gaze in designing digital products is fixed on systems, standardization, and the notion of best practices to solve problems. We have a set of tools that we apply to what is fundamentally an immeasurably nuanced set of questions and needs. When we finish using the tools, we distribute linear updates. In other words, we too practice mass production and address each weed in the field with incremental improvements. In actual application of our practice, it isn't the conversation that's gotten faster, it's the distribution. And our responses to externalities can only happen in aggregate because we're only shipping one app or product at a time. An aggregate approach means that, in all likelihood, no one thing is designed for any one person. On the other side of things, as people called users ourselves, we find ourselves trying to fit into workflows, developing new intentions to satisfy our existing ones by learning to use interfaces, keeping up with abstract patterns like navigation and gesture controls along the way. As designers, we often operate with the received knowledge of our industry, which is itself shaped by the received knowledge of our economy. A lot of that knowledge relies on the idea that user intent is something that needs to be predicted, documented, worked around, and in some cases most insidiously influenced by the product makers. It's an approach that sees consumption, not creation, as a primary mode of experiencing the world and using technology, and I think this is starkly reflected in our work. As a response to this, in 2015 and 2016, I began working on Project Phoebe, which was my first foray into imagining a different future for our discipline. I discussed the need for interfaces to make themselves prolific, becoming what each person needs rather than what an aggregate of many people may need. I want to revise that approach a little bit today by adding that interfaces should be based not only on individual needs, but also intentions, those that are crucially not the ones established by designers. Interfaces should follow rather than shape the needs and intentions of the user. The process of moving toward this goal, I think, will fundamentally transform our approach to designing interfaces. To begin to get an idea of what that means, consider what it might be like if the people who we now call users were instead creators. If the people who are now expected to passively experience and consume a product, dutifully reproducing results designed by our intention, actually could derive their own experiences by expressing their intention. How radically different could our work as designers and developers of all types be? In a SPAN 2015 session called The Interface, architectural historian John Harwood discussed the history of chair design as a means of understanding the object-subject relationship between people and the things that govern our experiences of the world. The talk began with Marcel Breuer, a modernist architect with a prolific portfolio of furniture produced during his time at the Bauhaus. Breuer understood the peculiarity of the dynamic between creator and experiencer, illustrating in a 1926 poster that chair design, quote, gets better and better every year. In the end, one sits on an elastic air column. The humor of imagining that the concept of a chair will be transformed into something that is indeed so elastic that it no longer exists must stand side by side with the lived experience of all chair sitters that actually, chairs are often not that comfortable, and one chair has difficulty supporting multiple needs. Even if a chair is great for one purpose, like seating many people at an event, or fitting into a corner, or looking great on the patio, it might not support you after a long hike, hold you and your child as you read a book together, or survive the bad weather. An invisible elastic air column really doesn't sound so bad to me. This example just underscores that the concept of interface as a description of the dance between subject and object, between human and technology, has been floating around for a long time. The chair was understood by Breuer and others to be one interface, something nominally, if not practically, designed with a human in mind, but ultimately as a static object exerting its own will on the person who ends up sitting in it. Architecture, the tangible outcomes of which is itself an interface, already recognizes the potential here, edging physical products toward a malleable, dynamic mode of experience through movable elements like shoji panels, curtain walls, and other components that allow occupants to easily reconfigure physical space in a way that a chair usually can't. We know, as creators of digital environments, that we have an exponentially larger capacity for expressing this type of potential in our work. An interface in actual space, as opposed to digital or virtual, could be the physical contact between your body and a chair, while ours is often finger, voice, eye, or ear to device. Consider that a chair rarely learns from its user how they sit, or where they want to put their feet, or what they're able to do with their hands. One successful implementation of adaptable design based on user intention is the accelerating development of variable type technology, fonts that are not packaged as individual styles, as foundries have done for hundreds of years, but are rather one program that contains a continuum of possible expressions of a typeface. The product of the design process for a variable typeface does not presume to know or understand the intent of the creators who will work with it later. Graphic designers and typographers are constrained only by which variables or axes are made available in the typeface. When I studied in the Type at Cooper program in New York, I learned from Hannes Femira that a font, the instance of the typeface we were designing in class, was just one point in a multidimensional field called the design space. The variables in variable type, called axes, run through this conceptual space. Anywhere there's an axis, we can see a continual line of expression through the design space. Some axes, like weight, run straightforwardly from one point to another, for example, from thin to extra bold. Others intersect each other, drawing themselves into two dimensions. I saw and still see digital interfaces as existing within their own kind of design space, where axes like touch and visual acuity, focus, time, and others could all influence the instance of an interface with which the user is presented. And today, we actually do have a few ways of instantiating somewhat complex axes in our work. A simple place to start is adaptation across screens. In material design, we've created guidance for adapting screens from large to small. The screens or breakpoints that we document could be understood to represent individual values within one axis, in this case screen size, running through the design space of an interface. But if we stop for a second, it becomes easier to imagine moments where other axes may be running parallel nearby or intersecting with screen size in interesting ways that we must account for. For example, on a very large or small screen, we can make certain assumptions about the device to which it belongs. A screen that's TV size might actually be a TV, and this is information that we have access to when we create an interface. What then might be the other axes overlapping with screen size? Design guidance for TVs specifically draws focus to things like attentiveness. We can draw from research and our own experience a rough knowledge of how attentive a person is when they're watching TV, and create an interface that matches that attention with the right level of detail, size of components, and types of information. The way we organize actions around that information could comprise another axis having to do with something like input modality. On a TV, you're likely to be using a remote control, a gamepad, or some other input device, rather than directly contacting the screen. These possible modalities represent steps along another axis, and this axis will inform how the interface is ordered in your app. How quick is it, for example, to traverse from one item to the next, or to reach a desired item from the top of the screen? The natural direction of this line of thinking is to fully realize these axes, seeing an individual interface as one point in a multidimensional design space containing all interfaces for a given app, allowing an interface to function as one piece of technology that contains within it a fuller range of possible expressions that are directly guided by individual need and intention. Material U, which was introduced with Android 12, is a small step in this direction, opening up the system to an unknowable form of intent, in this case a user-selected wallpaper, which it uses to inform fundamental qualities of the interface, in this case color schemes of interfaces and imagery. In this case, the axis of color expression is populated by the HCT color space, which was created specifically for accommodating unknown user intent with perceptually consistent responses. There is, of course, much more work to be done to realize a fully adaptive future at a system level, whether we're talking about a design system or an operating system, and I personally think we're talking about both. But let's zoom back out for a moment to understand why this model of design, a model where users can directly influence their own interface, is important. Carrie Murphy is a co-founder of The Fabricant, a studio that produces virtual couture, that is, clothing that exists only in virtual space. When designing garments for virtual space, Murphy says that a studio uses the language of physical clothing design, while materials are unbounded by normal physical constraints. The raw materials, he says, are data. The texture, strength, color, weight, and dimensions of the fabric are expressed as ones and zeros. In our discussion on design notes, Murphy also divulged his experiences creating and manipulating a virtual avatar of himself. Through trying on challenging new garments from his studio and programming his body to perform heretofore impossible movements, Murphy uncovered something about the self-actualizing potential of digital or virtual experiences. This embodiment allowed him, as it allows others, to reflect on what it would be like if their actual world intentions could be easily satisfied. More than that, it drew into question the subject-object relationship that Breuer and others would have assumed before the advent of sophisticated digital interface. Suddenly, the will of the images being presented to Murphy was actually aligned with his will as a subject, directly shaped by it, in fact. The conversation became two-sided, and both sides were in agreement. Tom Belsdorff echoes this dynamic in his ethnographic work on virtual worlds, including in his book, Coming of Age in Second Life, noting that corporations who simply saw Second Life as interactive were misrecognizing interactivity for creation. Residents interacted by creating the objects that they were consuming in self-actualizing acts. The implications for virtual worlds from these two quotes, where residents can create their own body, clothing, house, and decorations using data as raw materials, are clear. The resident of the virtual world exists as an entity solely through their acts of creation within that world. Their intention for their own presentation in the virtual space is directly manifested through the world itself. Zooming back in, we have to ask, what about the implications for our work? How does any of this apply to us? Our work largely manifests itself within the borders of physical screens in the actual world. I think we can begin to get a better understanding of a digital interface's self-actualizing potential and what it might look like to give individuals the power to create their own experiences with our products if we consider what lies at the root of most digital interfaces today: information and action. These, I've come to think, are the building blocks of what we would now call user experience. From these primitives, we derive components like a button. Components afford interactions, and these come together into UI regions. UI regions comprise screens, and screens comprise flows, and flows comprise apps. You've almost certainly seen it broken down like this before, from small abstracted concepts to large practical applications. But I think information and action are the smallest particles that we can observe directly. Another foundational constraint that we often acknowledge in design is human factors, or the realities of the human body and cognition that impact how people are able to interact with an object. These principles, which have been variously documented by standards bodies and design practitioners, myself included, often appear at the bottom of a layer cake of considerations and discussions of interface design. But I think in a model organized from the principles of information and action, human factors are more like the shape of the cake itself. In the future presented here, individual intent would be a human factor that, just like touch, voice, vision, hearing, cognition, and all the others, we must be able to account for in the things that we create without precise knowledge of what it is or how it might change over time. In other words, if information and action are the primitives that grow into an interface, how people choose and are able to interact with technology at that interface is a superseding layer, and that is where true adaptation really lives. In the more distant future, I believe that the interfaces we encounter on our personal devices will be much closer to a pure flow of information and action rather than being deliberately and carefully grown from primitives into entire distinct user flows and applications. The interface will exist in a framework that allows it to spontaneously arise and configure itself into emergent patterns based on the intent and the subjectivity of the person using the device. The interface is, in this model, still the site of our encounter with technology, but the dynamic between object and subject shifts, and we will see our own intent directly shaping the interface with which we're presented. We will, in other words, have the equivalent of Breuer's elastic air column, but for every interaction that we have with our device. It's clear that changing the way we understand and practice our discipline will be complex. It will rely on new technology, experimental thinking, expanded resources, new tools, and a theory of design that reckons with our own position in the world as designers. In another interview for Design Notes, Senior UX Design Manager Rob Giampietro underscored the gravity of our work and the importance of recognizing it. He said, "You're deciding when someone should turn the page, how heavy their phone is that they pick up every day, whether they need to swipe to get more information. All of those things are ways that you're changing someone's experience of their life through design, and I don't think there could be a more transformative discipline than that." And transformative is an apt word here. When we design something, implement it, and put it into the world, we are causing a transformation. At the surface level, we're transforming someone's experience of their life. I think that's big enough. But we're also transforming and potentially constraining the range of possible experiences by making choices about what our products can do and how they can do it. And we're transforming ourselves. Our discipline often puts us, our perspectives, our experiences, our beliefs, into the world within the products we create just by virtue of the fact that we're humans creating things for other humans. And I think that should ensure that the future of design is in so many ways personal. Thank you all again for coming to this session. Again, this is just an introduction to some of the ideas that I could fit in 25 minutes, and I'll be putting a full essay that goes into greater detail over on my blog, so I hope you'll check it out and give me your thoughts. Have a great rest of your conference. Sure. I think we have 3 minutes and 25 seconds if there's any questions.
If you have any question, don't hesitate. Cool.